Yeah.
All right, guys. So today we're going to start topic 4.6, monetary policy. So let's go ahead and begin with monetary policy. All right. So remember that the U.S. economy has two toolboxes that it can use to fix a problem, right? It's got the fiscal policy, right, which is the government, the federal government, and that deals with G in our GDP equation, right? And you can spend, increase government spending or decrease government spending. You could increase taxes or decrease taxes using both of those or either of those options, right? Using contractionary or expansionary policy, right? And then the other side of that is monetary policy. And monetary policy, again, is separate from the government. It's a separate entity, right? So they kind of operate and do things on their own. They can listen to what the president has to say, suggestions, but ultimately the chairman makes the decision on what happens. And what they can do is they can increase the reserve ratio, right? They can mess with the discount rate, like increase or decrease the discount rate, and then open market operations, so they can buy and sell bonds. Increasing or decreasing the money supply. And we saw on Monday, right? We saw the last video, we saw that by moving the money supply, you can increase or decrease the interest rate, right? There's more money in the economy, the interest rate's going to decrease. There's less money in the economy, the interest rate's going to increase, okay? Now, right now, the federal chair or the Fed chair is his name is Jerome H. Powell, right? It formerly was Janet Yellen, but he is now the federal chair and Fed chair and has been for I think this is his third year doing it. Okay. So again, the shifters for the money supply curve, which let me draw that out for you guys real quick. The money supply curve is going to be quantity of money, the nominal interest rate, money demand curve, money supply curve. Okay. Again, so the Federal Reserve, what they do is they shift this curve right here, okay? This money supply curve, and then so they can increase the money supply, which would decrease interest rates, or they can decrease the money supply, which would increase interest rates. Again, that inverse relationship with those two. And again, the shifters for that curve are going to be the reserve ratio, the discount rate, or open market operations, okay? Now, the reserve requirement. So when you go in to deposit money, right, we've kind of already covered this a little bit and with doing the bank balance sheets, right? But when you go in to deposit money, the bank holds a set amount, and they're required by the Federal Reserve to hold that amount, right? And that's the reserve requirement. Right now it's 10%, right? And then from that, they're able to lend out the rest of their money, right? And the rest of that money is fractional reserve banking. And that's that multiplier effect that we get from it. So for every $100 that you go in and deposit into your bank, 10 goes to the reserve requirement, and then the 90 gets lent out. And then, of course, there's that multiplying, that magnitude that's attached to it that creates the money, right? Creates more money. All right, so the reserve requirement is the reserve ratio is the percent of the deposit that banks must hold in the reserve. This percent cannot be loaned out, right? So if the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, it increases the amount of money held in bank deposits. So banks keep some of the money in reserves and then they lend out more, right? So if we increase the money supply, right, that's going to make banks, it's going to have more money in the market. So more money in the market means that interest rates are going to be lower, right? So if interest rates are lower, banks are going to be, it's easier for people to take out loans, or people are being more interested in taking out loans, right? So these loans eventually become deposits for another bank that will loan out their excess reserves, right? So creating more and more and multiplying more and more money, right? So now, um, if there's a recession, like for example, how does the Federal Reserve use the reserve requirement to manipulate the money, right? To manipulate the economy. Okay, so let's see if there's a recession. So right now there's a recession. So the Fed could do what they could do is they could decrease the reserve ratio. So if they decrease the reserve ratio, right, that means that banks don't have to hold on to as much money, right? So they're able to lend out more money. So if they lend out more money, what's going to happen? That's going to multiply even more, right? And so, and if you, I think it increases the multiplier, but I'd have to see, right? But anyway, if you increase the no, it decreases the multiplier, but anyway, it puts more money out into circulation, right? And it multiplies even more, right? If that makes sense. Not more money into circulation, I'm sorry, but more, it creates more fractional reserve banking by lowering the reserve ratio. Okay, so if you only have to hold 9% as opposed to 10%, you're able to lend out that 1% difference, right? Or if you were required to lend out 10% or to hold on to the reserve requirement was 10%, now it's 5%, right? Then you have more money in excess reserves, and that excess reserves can get loaned out, right? So, for example, just like right now, if they were to change the reserve requirement, which hardly ever gets changed, right? But there was actually an article, I think, in the Wall Street Journal that said that they were considering changing the reserve requirement. Well, if they changed it, right now it's at 10%. If they lowered it, right, that's one of the things they would do because of we're in a recession, right? So, and then of course this would make it easier to create more loans for the banks, and so on, right? Eventually, this is going to increase the money supply, and then aggregate interest rates, causing interest rates to fall, and then eventually aggregate demand should come back up, right? So in a recession, you would decrease the reserve ratio. Now let's flip the side. Let's flip the coin. Let's say we're in a peak, right? And of our, remember our business cycle. If we're in a peak or at the top or an inflationary gap, then what they would do, or what the Federal Reserve could do, is increase the reserve ratios, requiring banks to hold on to more of their money. If they hold on to more of their money, then they're not able to lend out as much, right? And so that they're not able to lend out as much, interest rates will start to go up, right? Since interest rates go up, then aggregate demand goes down, right? Because if you're a business right, you're not going to want to buy equipment for your restaurants or for whatever business you own because interest rates are so high, right? So you're going to wait to take out that loan, right? So, and then of course, consumers, right? Even consumer spending. If we make a large purchase, right, like a car or something like that, maybe we wait until interest rates are a little bit lower before we make the purchase, right? Okay. So the second shifter is going to be the discount rate, and that is the interest rates that the Fed charges commercial banks, right? So let's say that a bank, for the Bank of America or Wells Fargo or any banking bank out there, needs $100 million, right? So they borrow it from the U.S. Treasury, which the Federal Reserve controls, right? They control the Treasury, and so there's a discount rate which they in turn charge an interest rate to that bank. Now, let's say at the end of the day, the balance sheet, at the end of the day, every bank needs to balance out, right? They need to make sure. Now, let's say that for some reason there was a mistake, right? And some teller or somebody made a loan and they aren't balanced, right? Well, when they report that to the Federal Reserve, right, because they have to report it to the Federal Reserve every day, if they're not balanced, then they need to take out a loan. Now, this is one of the ways that they can take out a loan, is through the discount rate. And so now they can't do it that often, right? It's, like a few times they can do this, right? Otherwise, they're out of compliance or whatever, and I'm not sure exactly what happens, but they probably would lose the bank charter if they're constantly borrowing money from the Federal Reserve. But anyway, it's an option for banks just in case, right? Now, so there's the two ways that we can do this is easy money policy and tight money policy. So easy money policy is the Federal Reserve decreases the discount rate, right? And then tight money policy is when the Federal Reserve increases the discount rate, okay? So easy money policy means it's easy for the banks to get money from the Treasury, right? Tight money is it's hard to get money from the banks, right? Because the discount rate is higher, right? The percentage that they're gonna have to pay back, right? The interest that they have to pay back is gonna be higher, okay? And that, of course, is the discount rate. All right, now, next one is open market operations. So open market operations when the Federal Reserve buys or sells government bonds or securities, right? This is the most important and widely used monetary policy, right? And this one's pretty easy to understand, right? Now, so think about this. If I'm the Federal Reserve, right, and I have a bunch of bonds, right, these pieces of paper that I'm going to issue out, and if I were to sell bonds, right, what am I getting in return for those bonds? Well, I'm getting cash, right? So I can hold on to that cash. Now, so if I'm selling bonds, what's going to happen to the money supply curve? Well, the money supply curve should shift to the left. Why should it shift to the left? Because now the Federal Reserve has all that money. They're not going to put it back into circulation. They're just going to hold on to it and put it in the US Treasury, right? Now, if they were to buy bonds from people, right, and you go in and you sell them your bond, right, you're giving the Federal Reserve a bond, right? And in exchange for that bond, they're giving you cash. Well, that cash is now out into circulation, right? And so what's that going to do to our money supply curve? That's going to shift it to the right, okay? So easy way to remember these things is buy big, right? So buy big is going to increase the money supply, and sell small. Small is going to decrease the money supply. And just think about that. Just run that through your head. Like if I go in with a bond and the Federal Reserve gives me money for that bond, that's putting more money into circulation. That's going to increase the money supply. If they sell me a bond, right, that's going to decrease the money supply curve because they're going to be taking money out of the circulation and putting it in the U.S. Treasury. Okay. All right. Now, other thing that we have here is the federal funds rate, and this is the interest rate that banks charge to one another for one-day loans of reserves. Again, so earlier I used that example that you can go to the Federal Reserve to take out loans. Well, banks can make loans between each other all the time, and that's the target rate where they kind of tell banks like, hey, look, try to, when you charge each other interest, or you charge each other, when you guys take loans out from each other, right, try to hit this this rate. And let me get to that here in a second. But anyway, federal funds rate it's used quite a bit. And again, it's to balance out those balance sheets, right? Like let's say a teller's made out, or they've made too many loans, right, for the day, and they don't have enough in their for the reserve requirement. Well, if they don't have enough in the reserve requirement, then they need to call another bank and take money out, borrow money from that bank to balance out their balance sheet. Okay. So another thing here is that, and I'm sorry, with the target rate, is that the Federal Reserve simply can't tell banks what interest rates to use. Banks decide on their own what interest rates they're going to use. But if there's more money in the account, like there's more money in the market, they can decide what interest rate to use. So it's going to be a smaller interest rate, right? Because there's more supply, right? So like if you're a bank, if you're Wells Fargo and you're charging a very high interest rate, well, not a lot of your customers are going to be taking out loans, right? So you're just going to take your money and go somewhere else to another bank and take out loans from them. So, but the Federal Reserve influences them by setting a target rate that's used and using open market operations to hit the target. So the federal fund rates fluctuates due to market conditions, but it is heavily influenced by monetary policy, the buying and selling of bonds, okay? So this curve, the other two hardly ever get adjusted, right? The big one that happens, or is going to manipulate this curve in real world examples, is the buying and selling of bonds, okay? So now we're going to take this graph, right? And we're going to apply that to the ADAS model, okay? So it's kind of take everything that we've learned and put it into, put them together, right? Now, but before we get into that, I do want to show you one more graph, real simple graph, right? And it's pretty, I mean, you should understand it already, but interest rates, okay. So here we can see this is going to be the investment demand. So I for our GDP equation, right? So if interest rates are high, that means that businesses are not going to invest, right? Because, or they're not going to invest as much, right? Because interest rates are so high. And we can see that right here, right? So if on our demand curve, quantity of investment, right? And you can see that there's an inverse relationship with quantity of investment and interest rates. So if interest rates are low, there's going to be a lot of investment. If interest rates are high, there's going to be very little investment, okay? So if we're to look at the money supply curve, right? Let me just go ahead and draw these out real quick. The last one's an ADAS model. Okay. So here we go. We've got these three graphs, right? We've got the money supply curve, right? We've got the investment demand curve, and then we've got an ADAS model. Okay, so let's just say see what happens when we manipulate the money supply curve. So if we increase money supply, okay, you shift that to the right. Let's say that the Federal Reserve starts to buy bonds. Okay, buy bonds is going to shift the curve to the right. It's going to make it bigger. Yes, buy big. So this is M as sub 1. Okay. So what happens to interest rates? Well, interest rates are now going to decrease. Okay. It's point A, it's point B. Interest rate 1, interest rate 2. So now that they decrease, what's going to happen? That increases investment, right? So now more people are investing. If more people are investing, right, what's going to change in our GDP equation or our AD equation? Of course, I is going to change, right? So that's going to increase I. So if that increases I, what gets shifted down here on our ADAS model? AD2, AD1. So now what happens to our price levels? Our price levels now increase, right? So our aggregate demand increases and our GDP increases as well, right? So if we're in a recession, what is the Federal Reserve going to want to do? They're going to want to buy bonds, right? Now, moving on to, let's look at another example, but in this case, we're going to sell bonds or we're going to shorten the money supply, okay? Okay, so if they sell bonds, that's going to shift our curve to the left, right? And that's going to increase interest rates, right? Interest rates have gone from this level right here to this level right here. So IR1, IR2. So here, if interest rates increase, this is IR1, IR2, point A, point B. Okay, so if interest rates increase, what happens to our investment? our investment's going to decrease, right? So if investment decreases, what's happens to our aggregate demand curve? That's going to shift to the left. Aggregate demand shifts to the left. What happens to price levels? Price levels lower, right? However, what happens to GDP? GDP lowers, right? Our output lowers, our unemployment increases, right? You see all those things from our ADAS model. So if we are in an inflationary gap, then you're hoping that the Federal Reserve then starts to sell bonds, okay, and hold on to the money supply by increasing the interest rate, okay. And in turn to fight inflation, right? Like the Federal Reserve is doing all of these things to fight off inflation, right? And that's why you don't want the government or the Federal Reserve to not do anything, because if they don't do anything, then we could be subject to very high inflation, right? So there's the joke, right, that the Federal Reserve takes away the punch bowl just as the party's getting started, right? Like, because, just as we get in that inflationary gap or that peak, right, everybody's got a job, people are spending money, things are going good. The Federal Reserve is going to try to not put us in a recession, but they're going to try to cool off the economy, and or the government, right, or the U.S. government, and by manipulating GE. So either one of those is going to slow down the economy. And the reason why they want to slow down the economy is because they want to make sure that those peaks are not too high, right, and the lows or the troughs are not too low, right? They want to keep them as close as they can to that trend line, so that there's not too much jump back and forth, right? So here, probably in the next, when we get out of this COVID-19 thing, we'll be able to see the business cycle, and you'll be able to see, like, we were at a peak, and then you're going to see a big, huge drop for the trough, right? And then hopefully we get back to the peak, and hopefully it happens soon, right? But we'll see. Okay, so there's some examples of some bank balance sheets. We already went over how to do a bank balance sheet. We can do one more here for you. Okay. And then that's also kind of including the money supply. So what I want you guys to do is on slide 23, go ahead and write that bank balance sheet out, so that you guys can manipulate this as we go through this, right? So okay. So it's reserved. Yep. Okay, so this is okay. So you should have this written down on your paper, right? And so let's see if you can see this a little bit better. Hopefully you guys can see that pretty good. Okay, so here we have the reserve requirements are 2,000, the excess reserves are 3,000, the treasury bonds are 5,000, and the loans for that bank are 15,000. That's going to total 25,000, right? Over here you have demand deposits for 20,000, owner equity for 5,000, for a total of 25,000. Okay, so now what's going to happen if the Federal Reserve comes in and they buy $1,000 worth of bonds, right? Well, the first question, right, is what's going to happen? Well, let's see what happens to everything. Okay, so they come in and they buy the bonds. So Nothing's going to happen to the reserve requirement, right? Because the reserve requirement over here in the demand deposits, nothing's changed there quite yet, right? So that stays the same. Now the excess reserves, what happens to excess reserves? Excess reserves changes from 3,000 to 4,000. Why? Because the Federal Reserve just came in and bought those bonds, right? So that changes that. Okay. Now the next is how much more can the bank lend out than it was able to lend out before? Well, how much can they lend out more? Now they can lend out 1,000 more than they were able to before because they were able to lend out 3,000 before. Now they're in excess reserves. They have 4,000. Okay. And so the next question is how much is that going to change the money supply curve? Well, we need to see what the multiplier is, right? And remember, what is the multiplier? The multiplier is 1 over the reserve ratio, okay? So what is the reserve ratio for this problem? We have 2,000, right? And our demand deposit is 20,000. So what percentage is 2,000 of 20,000? Well, it's 10%, right? So 1 over 0.1, that's going to equal 10, right? So 10 times the 1,000 that they purchase, right, that the Federal Reserve purchases, that's going to magnify 10 times, or it's going to multiply that 1,000 by 10, right? So you're going to get an increase of 10,000 in the economy just based off of that, the Federal Reserve coming in and buying that, right? So that's going to change the money supply curve, or the money supply, by 10,000, right? And so the maximum that it's going to stay in the banks, right? The maximum of that 10,000 that's going to stay in the banks is 10% of that, right? And what is 10% of the 10,000? Well, it's 1,000, right? So that'll keep that the same, right? And so the maximum that it'll change the bank deposits, well, it's going to be 9,000, right? And why is it going to be 9,000? Well, because you're going to take the reserve requirements out, and then you're going to change the reserve. I'm sorry, you're going to change the demand deposits to that amount as well. Okay. Any questions on that? I think we're good on that problem. But again, that's your balance sheet, right? Okay. You know what? One thing is just this side isn't. I don't know if you guys noticed, but this is not balanced, right? This is going to equal 26,000, right? This is still equaling 25,000. There's something that we didn't change, right? The bank's going to buy Federal Reserve, is going to buy bonds from them, right? So we take this 5, and we'd have to switch this to a 4, right? Because they're buying those T bonds from them. Okay. Again, T bonds are just pieces of paper that are issued that the bank would just hold on to, and they'd be able to cash them in. Or you or I can go buy savings bonds or different types of bonds, and we could just hold on to them, and then we're going to cash them in and get the interest based off of those. Is that cool? All right. Okay. So. And I think that's going to be it for us today. There's some practice FRQs that you guys can do on your own. If you guys have any questions about those, I definitely start looking over those. Those of you guys that are going to be taking the AP test, pretty certain they're going to ask a bank balance sheet. And move this bank balance sheet is going to be with moving the money supply curve, along with how that's going to affect an ADAS model. It's one of the guesses that I would have for what an AP test of this magnitude, right? There's only be like 2 or 3 questions, that you have to understand everything from the beginning of the class to the end to be able to do that. So that's something I would definitely look at, those of you that are taking the AP test. But if not, just, we'll see you guys next time.